Hi everyone, welcome to After Dark Analysis. Today I'm going to be talking about a subject a lot of horror fans seem divided on. Whether it's better to see violence in a horror film or see violence in a horror film and let your imagination fill it in. I'm going to do this by looking at the the 1996 film Thesis from Spain and the 2007 film Snuff 102 from Argentina. While the points of origin may be slightly different for these films, they do share a lot of key things in common. Both of them are Spanish language films. Both of them seem to use a somewhat darker and more muted color palette. Thesis is completely in color, and the colors just seem very toned down. Snuff 102 is black and white. It will then cut to very degraded, almost VHS-style filmmaking that does have a lot of color, but it's so saturated and broken up, it kind of tones it all down. And the biggest thing they both have in common is they both involve women exploring violence in the media. Thesis is about a woman researching it for her thesis project. Snuff 102 is a journalist researching violence in the media for an article. So while the end product of what they write may be completely different, the research methodology is very similar. The biggest difference between these two films is how the violence is portrayed, though, because it's very hard to make a film talking about violence without seeing or at least implying some kind of violence. Thesis revolves around a girl named Angela. She ends up befriending a classmate who's known for having a large collection of violent videos and pornographic material. Through her research, she ends up stumbling across a snuff tape. After repeated viewings, she ends up connecting that this may have taken place on her college campus. And things kind of go from there. The interesting part about this is, while the movie focuses on violence, we actually don't really see much of it. When they first view the snuff film together, the male character is staring wide-eyed and very intently at the screen and doesn't move away. Angela keeps kind of covering her eyes or turning her back to it each time they watch it. What us, the viewer, get is either shots of Angela's reaction, her male companion's reaction. Every now and again it'll cut to the video, but if it does, it's always an extreme close-up on something not violent happening or something that's enough to imply what's going on. But the viewer will hear all of it. We get the screaming, and that doesn't cut out or change. So it's more of a audio experience than it is a visual experience like we would normally associate with violence, which can be very guttural and very hard to deal with because many people say they can handle real death as long as they don't hear it. Even though we don't tend to think of it as an audio experience, it very much is. A kind of example of this technique of implying what's going on is there's a point where they do zoom in on the bloody face of a girl that we've figured out is deceased because she's no longer screaming. Before we get the cut to the screen, though, we hear a chainsaw revving. So we see her body vibrating a little bit and can put together what's going on with the sound, but aside from some blood trails on her face, you don't get anything. Another really strong example of this is the ending, and this is not a spoiler at all. There is a news program covering violence, and they say, now we're going to show the tape, and the film cuts and credits roll. We actually don't get to see the violence that ever happened on what they're reporting on in the news. We barely get to see it on the snuff tape. The film Thesis completely relies on people are going to fill in the blanks. And we've known this about horror for quite some time. I've referenced the bad scene on this channel multiple times, and specifically Leroy's death. We see a little bit of smoke, we hear him screaming, but we don't actually see Leroy die. We don't see any of that. We see people trying to put him out, but we don't see Leroy. To be fair, the old black and white movies kind of didn't have to push the envelope that much because film was still a fairly new medium. It was very easy to show somebody something they hadn't seen before. And also, the censorship codes at the time were insane, especially under the Hays laws. Even a lot of the pre-code films, by today's standards, are incredibly tame and not salacious at all. The cutting technique Thesis uses is very reminiscent of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. To this day, there is a very infamous scene where the other face picks a girl up and puts her on a meat hook. The problem is, people are still to this day arguing with cast and crew that they saw the meat hook go in. You do not see the meat hook go in. He lifts her up, he puts her back near the hook, but we never actually see the entry point of it going in. This is absolutely an example of we all filled in the blank. Oh, there's a sharp hook, there's her back. These hooks are meant for holding meat, which made the scene, especially at the time, much more violent, much more shocking than it actually was. Because people can use their imaginations, put that together, and in their head create a much more disturbing scene, especially if it was a smaller production that didn't have the budget or effects work to make a scene like that work. Instead of trying to blow their entire budget on making it work, they just used creative editing that gave you that response, and is sometimes arguably much more effective than actually showing you. This brings us to Snuff 102 from 2007. Now, fair warning, this movie opens telling you what it's going to be, and this is going to be full force. This is going to be you're seeing everything. We open on test footage and experimentation footage of a monkey. It then cuts to a man dismembering a body in a bathtub, and there's a heavy implication that he pleasured himself while looking at the body. It then jumps to somebody browsing the web and clicking on Snuff Fantasy, cutting to a pig being slaughtered, and those are the only two bits of animal cruelty in this. I believe both bits of footage are real. Not as in the director went out and tortured animals, but as in stock footage. After we get that, a critic says, until what point are you willing to watch? In other words, what do you want to watch? We then cut very quickly to a bound and gagged woman. In flashbacks, we establish that she is the female journalist. She is also Victim 102, hence the name, Snuff 102. She ends up looking at a bunch of shock websites. She ends up interviewing the critic that was quoted earlier, just kind of trying to go down the rabbit hole and see the wheres and the whys and the hows. Is this still a thing? During her journey, which is shot in black and white, we also get glimpses of what is going on with this killer that we know it's a male, but we don't know what they look like or anything like that. It's shot in almost an August Underground style of, it's not from his viewpoint, but it's like there's a very degraded camera in the room. And this is where we get those blasts of color, because not only are you going to watch what this guy does, it's not going to cut away. And if it does cut away, it's going to be to a close-up on the gore. But you are going to see every single act in full color. Because most of us as humans do not see in black and white this immediate relation when we go from something black and white that we can go, oh yeah, that's a movie, this isn't real, to that blast of color of going, okay, this feels more real. The stock completely changes, the mood completely changes, and obviously the tone and color palette change. Because in this room, he does have three women, Victim 100, Victim 101, and Victim 102, which is the journalist we're mostly following. Without giving away any major plot points, because again, we establish very quickly the journalist ends up in this basement, is Victim 100 is pregnant. So not only do we have that torturing and hurting of another human being, we have that torturing and hurting of another human being who is also carrying another life, because she's very, very far along. So both of these films set up the obvious heroine overcomes the evildoer, who in both instances just so happens to be a guy. But what we also have here are two very different philosophies. One, how to show violence in a film. One is you don't show much, you show just enough to get that fill in the blank. The other one is no, we're going to see everything. And while many do write off the you'll see everything as cheap and shock value and all of that, it definitely has its place and purpose. Think of a film like Irreversible. There is a rape scene in there that does not cut, it does not pull away, and it lasts for 11 straight minutes. You see the beginning, the middle, and the end of that act. You hear the character crying, you hear her trying to get away, you hear her attacker mocking her and saying these terrible things. While most people aren't ambivalent about the fact that rape is a bad thing, allowing that scene to take place the way it did, with both of the actors improvising and one long scene, can really put perspective on how terrible and violent things can really be. We saw the exact same rationale during the Mondo boom and Faces of Death. Were some of these coming out just to be exploitative and gross? Yeah, Absolutely. They were running under the guise of education. No one's going to lie about that. But there were others that actually did want to put perspective on things and did feel that showing these kind of things and these kind of acts and this level of real world violence was necessary for those that aren't living in those environments to understand and see what goes on other places. And while those rested on a mixture between real and fake, especially in Faces of Death, something that was very real is people's attitudes completely shifted in Vietnam because we were seeing things coming from over there. While war is absolutely something you cannot understand unless you've been there, it gave people this insight into what was being done and what these people were dealing with. Did the American public deal with it in the best way? Yeah, probably not. This is why we saw an increase not so much in transparency, but in generals being willing to talk to the public in the Gulf War, because everybody didn't want another Vietnam. Documentarians give this kind of perspective and let people know firsthand, yeah, this is what happens and it sucks. It makes perfect sense that filmmakers would want to bring that sense of honesty even in a fictitious universe. Well, yes, ultra-violent scenes will shock people and possibly drum up some controversy. That's not always a good thing. Plenty of films fail just because they were shocking for shock's sake. The films that successfully use this tend to have more meat behind them and more of a plot and something to say about the matter. So while yes, these films are very similar, they take two totally different paths in storytelling, and both are completely successful in making their point. One makes it through your imagination, the other makes it through look at it. It's right there in your face, you can't ignore it. So what do you think? Do you think filmmakers just shock to shock? Do you think there's a little bit more to it? Do you hate cutaways? Do you like cutaways? Let me know in the comments below. If you like what you're hearing, please hit like, subscribe, something like that. If you don't like what you're hearing, please leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you.